And welcome back. You're watching The Full View. The United Nations Secretary General has announced that the death toll for the national coronavirus, the global coronavirus, has surpassed the 1 million mark today. So this means the number of deaths from the novel coronavirus is now double the number of people who die annually from malaria. Our world has reached an agonizing milestone, he says. He released this in a statement earlier. And also this day, the United Nations Secretary General also saying that new approaches and solutions are needed to address worsening food loss and waste. Today is the first ever International Day of Awareness of Food Loss and Waste Reduction. That's after the General Assembly designated 29 September as the International Day. This in a bid to recognize the fundamental role that sustainable food production plays in promoting food security and nutrition and highlighting the essential need to reduce food loss and waste. Andy Duplessi is Managing Director of Foodforward South Africa. He joins me now. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us. So what is the situation in South Africa? How do we rank in terms of food loss and wastage?
So compared to the rest of the world, in countries like the United States and Europe, most of the food loss and waste takes on the post-consumer side, so household consumption. But in South Africa, roughly 30% of all our food is lost or wasted on the pre-consumer side. So that means what's happening on the side from agriculture, production, manufacturing, and retail before it reaches the shop shelves. That's where most of our food loss and waste takes place. Research shows that roughly 30% of all the food that's produced in South Africa is lost or wasted, costing our economy roughly 61 billion rand annually. And we're talking about 10 million tons of food on an annual basis in a country where food insecurity is at a huge crisis and growing.
Now, we'll talk about the food systems and why they are fragile in just a moment. But what has been the impact of COVID-19 on this phenomena?
The impact has been severe because prior to COVID-19, we were already in a food security crisis. According to research, roughly 14 million people were immediately at risk of food insecurity, and another 14 million were food insecure with immediate effect. But what we're finding now, and you'll see the data coming out today for second quarter unemployment figures, is a further 2.2 million people have lost their jobs. So effectively, we're talking about roughly 30 million people that have lost their jobs in this country, that are unemployed or that don't have the ability to secure food for themselves. So that's more than 50% of our population. And we need to look at innovative ways of how we can address this problem.
So before we do that, we obviously have to diagnose the problem. So the UN Secretary General rightfully calling this food loss and waste an ethical outrage in a world where he says enough food exists to feed people everywhere. But I want to know, South Africans themselves, do they understand food wastage and loss? As in, is it accidental or is it just downright gluttony? You spoke about how 30% is lost pre-consumer, but when it does get to the consumer, do they understand how it occurs and why?
I think households understand the problem very, very well. People, especially now with budgets being so tight, people understand that they need to manage their consumption, how much they purchase, what they are able to consume. And I think people are sensitive to that, generally speaking. I think the problem we have in our country is that within the supply chain, which is so massive and so complex, that is where the food loss and waste is taking place. And a lot of that is unavoidable, in spite of the fact that there are huge amounts of technologies built into saving food and making sure that food lasts for a long period of time. But we still have these losses because of overproduction, incorrectly labeled goods, problems in the production cycle, short-dated goods, etc.
And it's interesting that you should say that we've had many stories, especially with regards to coronavirus and food donations. We had a story just over the weekend of how food that's been donated has been lying in a warehouse for weeks. As you say, you talk about overproduction, but there are also those kind of things that make our food systems fragile. Other than what you've mentioned, let's talk about food insecurity, for instance. We're talking about a drought. That's not a man-made problem. What else can we do to ensure that there isn't food insecurity other than the factors that you've mentioned?
So I think we need to do a few things carefully. So, for example, on the farm side, on the agriculture side, we've just formed formal partnerships with Agri SA as well as the Citrus Growers Association. So in instances where a farmer has to harvest because the food is ripe, but yet the person or the company he's growing for, maybe they're not able to take everything that he's harvested, but he can do nothing about that. So in those instances, we have conversations with farmers and we encourage them to redirect those surpluses to organizations like ourselves. I totally agree with you. It's unacceptable that surplus food, and there's a misconception here. We need to understand when we talk about surplus food, we're not talking about subgrade food. We're not talking about food that's not edible. We are talking about good quality, edible surplus food that is perfectly good on the inside and perfect for human consumption. And we just need to have systems and processes in place to make sure that that food reaches the intended beneficiaries at the appropriate time. We have to have systems and checks and balances in place. Firstly, our organization doesn't take any food that is expired or that is rotten, and we have systems in our warehouses and in our processes to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we have to have conversations at farm level already, at farm gate level, to encourage farmers not to dump that goods in landfill, but rather to encourage them to donate that food, which is why the Food and Agriculture Organization has set this day aside, an international day, so that we understand that we can save that food before it's lost and before it gets wasted.
Now, let's talk about beyond squandering of natural resources. There's also the climate change factor. Now, most countries have, of course, a quest to the demands of the Paris Agreement. South Africa, as a country, what can we do to mitigate this?
So there's a few things that we can do quite cleverly. The first is we need to come up with better systems and technologies to make sure that from the farm gate to the fork on the table, we must make sure that we shorten the processes that food has to travel along the route. The second thing we have to do as a country, and we've been lobbying government for a while now to do this, is we need to look at policy mechanisms and put policies in place to make sure that food is not dumped. Organic waste to landfill shouldn't be happening. We must reduce that over time, and we need to have policies like France and Italy and Uruguay and Paraguay and those countries where they actually have laws that prohibit anybody from dumping good food that's edible and that's good for human consumption. Rather, there are laws to make sure that that food gets donated to non-profit organizations like Foodforward South Africa. So those are some of the things that we should be doing. We developed a piece of technology called Food Share, so that we make sure we prevent food waste even at stores, at retail stores. So we have partnerships with Pick and Pay, Food Lovers Market, as well as Woolworths. And so our technology is able to connect beneficiary organizations within a 5-kilometer radius of where a store is, and they go and collect that good usable surplus so that they're able to use it almost immediately. So those are the kind of technologies and innovation that we need to be putting into place to make sure that we avoid food loss and waste.
And I was going to ask you if genetic modification can ever be an answer to this. I know this is a debate for another day, but thank you so much for speaking to us. Duplessi, Managing Director of Foodforward South Africa.